The Cold School, Part 2, Episode 1, Moscow. I decided to meet my wife and daughter in Moscow. In any case, they had to transfer there. Back then, there were no direct flights from Kiev to Yakutsk, so I arranged my schedule carefully and asked to be assigned to a Moscow flight timed to coincide with their arrival from Kiev. Barely an hour after leaving Kiev, my wife was already standing in front of me at Vnukovo Airport with our daughter in her arms and two impossibly large Soviet suitcases beside her, looking calm despite the long trip still ahead of us. From there, we crossed the city to Domodedovo Airport, where our flight to Yakutsk would depart. True, unlike the direct Ilyushin Il-62 service, our Tu-154 flight involved two intermediate stops, but at least we would travel together. At that age, traveling together already felt like luxury. The weather that day was perfect. Warm air, clear skies, no thunderstorms anywhere along the route. At this point, however, I should probably explain my wife's decision. Moving from Kyiv, a large, comfortable Soviet capital, to distant Yakutia with a small child and extremely uncertain living conditions was already a serious step by itself. But the situation was more complicated than that. She had just graduated from the Kyiv Civil Engineering Institute with a degree in computer programming. Officially, the Soviet Union still maintained the status of young specialist, a system that granted recent graduates priority access to state housing. By then, during the stagnation years, these promises had already begun slowly collapsing under reality. Housing shortages were becoming severe everywhere. I technically possessed the same status myself, but in Yakutsk, construction had nearly stopped altogether. And judging by the way we had already been welcomed there, relying on Soviet housing guarantees required a certain amount of optimism. For her, however, the situation was entirely different. Relatives from every direction, including my own parents, begged her not to go north. A relative working in the construction sector had even offered to arrange a position for her in Kiev itself, together with guaranteed immediate allocation of a brand new two-room apartment. In Soviet terms, this was practically winning the lottery. But leaving for Yakutsk meant losing her young specialist privileges completely. Nobody would officially assign her there anyway, and even if they did, it would have changed nothing. People kept telling her, work 1 year in Kiev, get your apartment, and afterward, do whatever you want. Even I admitted that this probably sounded reasonable, although I never tried to pressure her either way. But she answered very calmly, "No, I'm not living without my husband." At that moment, the decision still sounded almost simple, and so there she was now, sitting with our daughter in the first row near the cockpit of our Tu-154, preparing to fly toward Yakutsk after voluntarily exchanging guaranteed Soviet stability for complete uncertainty. Our daughter, meanwhile, seemed interested mainly in the window. At least the beginning of the journey still looked romantic enough. Naturally, it did not stay that way for very long. Don't worry, this is not the point where the story suddenly turns into an aviation disaster movie. From a technical standpoint, the flight itself went perfectly. Then I noticed a familiar woman. Somewhere around 40 years old, she had flown with our crew once before on a Moscow flight. And the moment I recognized her, I felt a vague sense of alarm somewhere in my chest. As it turned out, not without reason. Episode 2, Raisa Fyodorovna. I stepped into the cockpit. "Ivan Petrovich," I said, "that Soviet deputy woman is sitting in the first row again, the one who used to fly with us before. Raisa Fyodorovna, I think." Ivan Petrovich visibly brightened. "You're kidding," he said immediately. Before continuing, I should probably answer the same question almost everybody later asked me after hearing this story. So, was she at least attractive? Not really. Raisa Fyodorovna was somewhere around 40 years old with a completely ordinary appearance. I am hardly an expert on fashion, but even I noticed she dressed rather badly. What stood out most were her hands, neglected nails that somehow did not match the image she was trying to project. My wife, for example, always managed perfect manicures entirely by herself. Still, these were Soviet times. Drawing attention to yourself through appearance was never particularly encouraged, so nobody considered this unusual. Besides, Raisa Fyodorovna was not an ordinary passenger. She traveled as a VIP official. Cars delivered her directly through the Special Deputies Terminal, reserved for members of the Soviet elite. During flights, she would casually enter the cockpit, chat with the crew, and demonstrate a kind of warm political friendliness. Once, during an intermediate stop somewhere, I think in Barnaul, she even brought gifts for the crew from the deputy's lounge. Today, it is difficult to explain properly what gifts meant in the Soviet Union. Everything was officially cheap. The problem was that many ordinary things simply could not be bought at all. By the stagnation years, shortages had already become a kind of parallel economic system. For members of the Soviet apparatus, however, special distribution channels always existed. That time, she brought two legendary Soviet luxuries. Please try not to laugh. Indian instant coffee and Latvian canned sprats. In those days, this genuinely qualified as luxury. Not for free, of course, but everybody was delighted anyway. Personally, I bought nothing. I had never understood the Soviet obsession with instant coffee, even during the peak of its popularity. Which was especially strange, because in large Soviet cities, perfectly good fresh coffee could be bought almost everywhere for very little money. Right beside the counter, they would grind the beans and prepare it in proper coffee machines. Back in Kiev, I usually ordered something called a double half. To this day, I still have no idea what that expression actually meant, but the coffee was excellent. So, naturally, the moment the autopilot was engaged and we settled into stable climb, Ivan Petrovich personally escorted Raisa Fyodorovna into the cockpit. Very quickly, they began talking almost like old friends. Then Raisa Fyodorovna revealed her terrible secret. This time she was not flying to Yakutsk merely as a privileged passenger. She calmly opened her folder, showed several official-looking documents, and announced that she had been sent to remove the head of the Yakutsk Civil Aviation Administration from his position. Nothing less. To understand the scale of this, one has to remember that throughout the enormous Soviet Union, there officially existed only one airline, Aeroflot. Every aircraft in the country belonged to it, from crop dusters and helicopters to giant long-range airliners. The system itself was divided into regional administrations, Yakutsk, Ukrainian, and so on. Those administrations were then divided into smaller local aviation units. For several seconds, Ivan Petrovich completely lost the power of speech. Then, recovering surprisingly quickly, he expressed a very warm and sincere desire to assist this important state mission. Our route included two intermediate stops. The first was Bratsk, deep in Siberia. The second was the newly opened airport in Neryungry, already inside Yakutia, and only about an hour from Yakutsk itself. Ivan Petrovich explained that he had worked in Yakutia for many years and therefore possessed extremely valuable insight into local aviation management. Armed with a pen and several sheets of paper, he spent almost the entire flight to Neryungry composing highly unofficial written assessments of the senior leadership of the Yakutsk Aviation Administration. Episode 3. The Investigation. Neryungry was still an extremely young city then, growing rapidly thanks to coal mining deep inside southern Yakutia. The airport itself stood near the small settlement of Cholman, surrounded by endless forest. At night, during overnight stops, wolves could sometimes be heard howling somewhere out in the darkness. But this time, we were making only an intermediate stop, partly for refueling, although many passengers were actually ending their journey in Neryungry. After that, the remaining flight to Yakutsk usually continued only half full. Raisa Fyodorovna also left the aircraft and walked into the terminal with the passengers. Why, I still do not know. She could easily have remained on board. Instead, she walked directly into catastrophe. Somewhere inside the terminal, she apparently became overwhelmed by the importance of her mission and started proudly informing transportation service employees that she was flying to Yakutsk to remove the head of the Yakutsk Civil Aviation Administration from office. Unfortunately for her, most of the transportation service employees were women, and Raisa Fyodorovna chose to speak to them in a distinctly superior and rather rude tone. Eventually, one of them lost patience and called a friend who personally knew the head of the Yakutsk Aviation Administration. The message was very simple. Listen, some woman just arrived here claiming she's flying to remove you from office. His response came immediately. Check her documents. That's your responsibility. Honestly, in retrospect, this was perfectly reasonable advice. At that point, the situation exploded. Raisa Fyodorovna began shouting, "How dare you? I'll have you all fired. But this time she had encountered people just as stubborn as herself. Someone called the local police chief in Neryungri. To everyone's surprise, he arrived personally. A solid-looking Soviet police major. Calm, serious, entirely professional, at least initially. He politely requested her identification documents. Raisa Fyodorovna announced that all her papers remained on the aircraft. So the police major personally escorted her back toward the aircraft in a black official Volga sedan. During the drive, she apparently spent the entire time threatening him, promising prison sentences, destroyed careers, and catastrophic consequences. The documents, however, she still never produced. In the end, the major decided not to arrest her. Instead, he developed what probably seemed to him an extremely sophisticated investigative strategy to continue flying with us to Yakutsk while observing the suspect more carefully. And during this operation, he discovered something deeply suspicious. My wife was sitting beside Raisa Fyodorovna. Apparently, this completed the picture. Soviet investigative logic had reached its conclusion. A criminal conspiracy. The presence of valid tickets and a small child disturbed this theory very little, so after arrival in Yakutsk, the police major detained my wife. Meanwhile, as later became clear, Raisa Fyodorovna herself was in fact a repeat offender posing as a Soviet deputy. But at that moment, nobody yet understood the full scale of the absurdity. The major locked my wife inside an office and interrogated her for an astonishingly long time, while the actual criminal calmly disappeared into the city after successfully terrifying an armed Soviet police officer nearly to death. I stood outside the door holding our daughter, who was not yet 2 years old after the exhausting journey across half the Soviet Union. At first, I tried remaining patient. Then the child started crying and asking for the toilet. At that point, patience ended. I began pounding on the door with both hands and feet. Eventually, the major released my wife and attempted to interrogate me as well. The conversation went poorly. In a highly undiplomatic form, I explained everything I thought about the situation, Soviet law enforcement, and his investigative methods personally. In response, he promised that I would never fly again. By then, I no longer cared. Eventually, even he began realizing something was wrong with the entire story. Still, Soviet bureaucracy never surrendered without one final counterattack. "And how much luggage are you carrying?" he suddenly demanded. "The allowance is only 20 kilograms. He went to inspect the baggage personally, but once again he failed. The crew had already quietly removed all our luggage from the aircraft themselves. Nothing remained for him except to release us. By then, we were barely alive from exhaustion. Approaching our dormitory building, I noticed light glowing in the navigator's room. I brought my wife and daughter home and said, "I'll be back in a minute. I'm just going to see the navigator." I opened the door. The entire crew was sitting around the table. Nobody asked questions. Someone immediately placed a full-faceted Soviet vodka glass into my hand, the heavy 250 milliliter kind that existed in every Soviet kitchen without exception. I had never been much of a drinker. But that evening, I emptied the glass with enormous pleasure. Oddly enough, I barely even felt drunk. The tension simply disappeared. Then I calmly and briefly told them everything that had happened. The crew listened silently and nodded. A few minutes later, I ran back home to my family. The funniest part, however, was that this ridiculous situation would soon bring us a surprisingly useful financial bonus. Episode 4. The weekend. A full weekend off in summer was a luxury for an airline pilot. People traveled far more during summer, but the number of crews remained exactly the same. Still, considering all our recent adventures, management decided to help us a little and gave me 2 genuine days off. What counted as genuine in Soviet aviation required some clarification. If you landed at 11 at night and your next departure was scheduled for 3 in the morning the day after tomorrow, then technically, tomorrow was considered a day off. In practice, it felt more like a short pause between 2 different forms of exhaustion. But this time, the weekend was real. We slept properly for the first time in weeks. The weather was hot and sunny, so we decided to go into the city, then down to the beach on the Lena River, breathe fresh air, and briefly pretend we were normal people. Fresh air around the airport district was a rather complicated subject. The smell had absolutely nothing to do with aircraft. Between the apartment buildings stood communal outdoor toilets surrounded by wooden fences. Inside were several wooden stalls with holes in the floor and a separate area for garbage. During the long winter, people used buckets as indoor toilets and later emptied them into those holes outside. But at temperatures below -50°C, the openings quickly froze over. There was nowhere else to empty the buckets, so enormous frozen formations of very specific color and character gradually rose above each stall, like strange, frozen cliffs. Then summer arrived. Everything thawed rapidly. Unfortunately, the permafrost underneath showed very little enthusiasm for absorbing any of it. So even today, whenever someone learns that I once worked in Yakutsk, they usually react with sympathy. Oh God, the freezing temperatures. Yes, I answer, but that was not the worst part. Compared to the airport outskirts, the stone-built center already felt almost civilized. Apartment buildings with proper sewage systems were considered luxury. There were very few normal trees, and fruit trees could not survive there at all. Fruits that simply fell from trees back home in Ukraine during summer were absurdly expensive in Yakutia, but the beach on the Lena in July was wonderful. The water was certainly not tropical, but it warmed up to around 22 degrees Celsius, enough for swimming without heroic sacrifice. We did not go sailing that day, even though I had already learned to handle the trimaran reasonably well. It was stable and fairly easy to control, but even during completely normal sailing, the boom still swept quickly across the cockpit during tacks. I suspected my wife might find it difficult to dodge a heavy wooden beam flying over her head while holding a small child. Fishing seemed safer. On the way to the beach, I bought fishing line, hooks, and a float from a small shop, broke a branch from nearby bushes, and assembled a fishing rod in about 5 minutes. Then I scooped some sand and shallow water into my hand, found tiny living creatures crawling inside it, attached them to 2 hooks, cast the line into the river, and handed the rod to my wife. Almost instantly, the float disappeared underwater. Pull! She was absolutely delighted when 2 fish emerged at once. Perch are predators. They attack bait with almost no caution whatsoever. We spent the day sunbathing, caught several kilograms of small perch, and returned home to cook a surprisingly excellent dinner. Everyone was exhausted by evening. I was too. Our daughter spent most of the day riding on my shoulders, but for the first time since arriving in Yakutsk, we had the feeling that life might actually be settling into something almost normal. The following day, I still had to visit the police station to give formal testimony regarding our fraudulent deputy, citizen Sokolova, who had already been located and arrested. My wife was not summoned this time. The Yakutsk investigators turned out to be competent people who quickly understood the overall situation. Everything was calm, professional, and remarkably civilized compared to our previous encounter with Soviet law enforcement. In fact, they barely questioned me at all. They simply handed me prepared witness statements and pointed where I should sign. Then I remembered something important. "What happened to my wife's tickets?" I asked. "As young specialists, we're supposed to receive travel compensation." The investigator looked genuinely apologetic. "Unfortunately, the tickets were attached to the criminal case file. Technically, that should not have happened, but now we can't remove them." For a moment, I thought our money had vanished into Soviet bureaucracy forever. Then he added, "But we can give you certified copies and an official document confirming the originals were seized." "Excellent," I answered immediately. The compensation could be claimed either through my workplace or through my wife's new job at Yakutsolotoprokat, where they were already waiting for her arrival. So naturally, we collected compensation from both. The certified copies were sufficient for my aviation unit, while the official seizure certificate worked perfectly at Yakutsolotoproekt. The Soviet state, after all, was a gigantic organization where one department rarely understood what another department was doing. At that point, we still considered this a great personal victory. The next challenge was finding a kindergarten for our daughter, so my wife could actually begin working. Naturally, there were no places available there either. Spi. Episode 5. Winter begins. Since childhood, I had been taught one unquestionable fact. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west. Summer in Yakutia was the perfect place to discover this was only approximately true. Both sunrise and sunset happened almost in the same part of the sky. Strangely enough, somewhere closer to the north. The sun barely slipped below the horizon before immediately climbing upward again, circling endlessly around the sky. At first, it felt almost unnatural. There was no real night, only short twilight, and then daylight returned once more. Finding a kindergarten for our daughter was solved the usual Soviet way, partly by luck and partly through unofficial human cooperation. The kindergarten urgently needed somebody to decorate a children's play corner, and there was nobody available to do it properly. Fortunately, Kolya, the third member of our Kiev expedition, turned out to be an excellent amateur artist. Drawing and painting were simply hobbies he genuinely loved, and by then, he had already begun missing creative work badly. Within a couple of days, Kolya transformed the kindergarten corner into something that looked almost luxurious by local standards. Our daughter received a place, and my wife was finally able to start working. Life gradually became almost normal. Not comfortable exactly, but considering our age, perfectly acceptable. The only problem was that summer in Yakutia turned out to be alarmingly short. By the end of August, the weather changed abruptly. Clouds covered the sky, and temperatures began falling with almost mathematical precision. There were no fluctuations. Every single day became colder by another couple of degrees. The process felt strangely mechanical. After reaching zero, the temperature showed no interest in stopping there and continued calmly downward into negative territory. By October, it was already -30. By November, -40. At the same time, daylight vanished just as rapidly. The heating system worked remarkably well. Despite terrible windows full of cracks, the apartments remained warm enough inside, although the inner window frames stayed permanently covered with ice. Meanwhile, the temperature kept falling. By December, it had passed -50 and settled there quite confidently. Sometimes, leaving home before a flight, I personally saw -57 on outdoor thermometers, while the Meteorological Service officially reported only -54. Operational limitations. Some extremely intelligent specialists, using highly scientific calculations, had determined that the minimum operating temperature for the 2154 was exactly -54 Celsius. Well then, -54 it is. The meteorological office could certainly help with that. After all, canceling a Moscow flight over a couple of insignificant degrees would have looked rather excessive. Aircraft preparation began 3 hours before departure. Engine heaters with long canvas air ducts started working first. One blasted hot air throughout the cabin, while another warmed the leading-edge slat mechanisms. On the 2154, the slats were electrically driven, and excessive resistance could destroy the clutch system. The flaps caused fewer problems. Well, almost fewer. Their hydraulic actuators were enormously powerful, so nothing actually broke. However, some equally intelligent engineers had calculated that flap deployment to 28 degrees should take exactly 14.5 seconds. This requirement had to be checked during pre-flight inspection. How anyone was expected to measure half a second in those conditions remained unexplained. Fortunately, nobody cared very much. In reality, the hydraulic fluid thickened badly in extreme cold, and the flaps usually extended in about a minute. And honestly, why rush? We deployed them before takeoff. Eventually, they reached the correct position, slowly but reliably. That was sufficient. After departure, they retracted just as slowly. The landing gear behaved similarly. Officially, it should retract in 25 seconds. In practice, it often took 40. But we knew our aircraft well. That was the important part. We understood perfectly which abnormalities were dangerous and which were simply northern reality. Engine power settings, visible shock absorber extension, hydraulic timing, almost everything looked technically incorrect compared to official manuals. Yet in actual operation, everything was completely normal for those conditions. As the aircraft gradually warmed up, all parameters slowly returned to standard values anyway. Oddly enough, the airplane worried me less than my wife. Our neighbors had frightened her with stories that at -50, the soles of winter boots could literally crack apart outdoors. And my Moscow rotation lasted 5 full days, which meant my wife also needed proper pre-flight preparation. Episode 6, -50. Both then and now, whenever people learn that I once worked in Yakutia at temperatures below -50 Celsius, they usually say the same thing. I heard the cold feels different there, easier somehow. This is a myth. The cold felt entirely real. I partially agree that human perception of temperature depends heavily on wind. And yes, at -50, there is usually almost no wind at all. But if even a slight wind appeared, the situation changed immediately. At that point, you sometimes had to walk literally backward into it. Otherwise, breathing became difficult almost instantly. At such temperatures, even smoking outdoors became nearly impossible. Our friend Kolya, for example, was a heavy smoker, but after a single attempt to smoke outside, he returned unable to breathe properly, clutching his chest and gasping for air. After that, he smoked only in specially designated indoor smoking rooms, which existed in almost every building there for exactly this reason. The clothing was highly specialized. Pilots received excellent winter equipment free of charge. On our feet, we wore tall fur boots, reaching almost to the knees. The outer layer was reindeer hide, with the fur facing outward. Inside was thick sheepskin turned inward. The soles consisted of heavy felt with no waterproof material whatsoever. But waterproofing was unnecessary there. In winter, there was no slush, no wet snow, no dirty puddles near store entrances like back home in Ukraine. Everything simply froze solid. Our coats were massive fur jackets made from thick, natural leather with enormous collars. Add a fur hat, enormous mittens, never gloves, always mittens. And eventually, only a narrow slit remained visible for the eyes, like sitting inside a tank. And even then, the skin on your nose still peeled afterward, as if you had returned from a southern beach resort with severe sunburn. I still laugh, remembering that even at -50, I occasionally participated in DND patrols. DND was another masterpiece of Soviet surrealism. The abbreviation stood for Voluntary People's Patrol. The word voluntary, naturally, required flexible interpretation. In practice, it meant that workers from various enterprises spent part of their free time assisting the police by patrolling the streets on foot and protecting public order. Usually, one police officer received 2 or 3 volunteers. This system existed throughout the Soviet Union, but at -50 in Yakutia, it achieved particularly absurd dimensions, especially because it remained unclear exactly what criminals were expected to be doing outdoors in such temperatures. Still, the Communist Party remained firmly in control. Incidentally, within Soviet aviation, pilots who were not party members could not fly international routes. Forget management positions. Even relatively minor promotions quietly depended on party membership. I was encouraged rather actively to join as well, but by then I already suspected that perhaps it was wiser to wait a little before making any long-term ideological commitments. Mikhail Gorbachev had recently come to power with his famous New Thinking, and I usually answered evasively, "To fly international routes, I first need first-class qualification. I still don't have enough flight hours." The explanation sounded respectable enough. Unfortunately, unlike pilots, my wife received no special Arctic equipment at work, and meanwhile, our neighbors continued terrifying her with increasingly detailed stories about the winter. Buying professional northern gear privately would have been extremely expensive. And besides, was it really necessary? I bought bread. There was little else worth searching for in the stores anyway. As for kindergarten and work, we finally decided not to panic in advance and simply see what happened using our ordinary clothing. And in any emergency, our friends from Kiev remained nearby. Not everyone left on long flights simultaneously. I still have an old black and white photograph from that winter. My wife is pulling our 2-year-old daughter through the snow on a sled. The child wrapped in so many layers of clothing, she resembles a small polar expedition. The boots survived. The soles did not crack. By then, it still seemed that we had successfully adapted to northern life. In reality, the most difficult period had only just begun.